I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Inez Stepman.
I'm Will Chamberlain.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast. Inez is going to kick us off today by covering Trump and Elon Musk's interview or conversation rather last night on X, as well as the attempts to censor it by the misinformation police out of the EU. Then Ben is going to walk us through the latest on immigration, namely how quickly immigration applications are being processed now. I will cover Kamala Harris stealing one of Trump's key platform promises, and then will close us out with a rundown of all of the claims surrounding Tim Walz's stolen valor regarding his time in the Minnesota National Guard. So with that, we will start with Inez.
Great. So there was a long interview between Trump and Musk on X last night, following some technical problems, which Musk said was due to an attack on the servers and the ability to process. He said they had tested it with 8 million people, and then it was not able to support more than I was one of many, and I'm sure you guys also, some of you guys were also trying to repeatedly get in to the space. It wasn't allowing it. But they did eventually get it off the ground. And there was a long discussion. Musk wanted to call it a discussion and not an interview. And I think that was a good description of it. It was very free flowing. We learned quite a bit. He asked Trump about how he felt about the assassination attempt. As a side note, it's incredible that there hasn't been a serious sit down in media with Trump to actually sort of do the human side of his story. He did it a bit himself at the convention, but there's been no interest, obviously, from the mainstream media in getting his side, a sort of human side of what it feels like to have a bullet clip your ear, meant for the center of your forehead. So they talked about that. They talked about the Secret Service. And then they talked about some policies. They talked about taxes. They talked about the border, immigration policy, just a crime, Latin America, just a really wide-ranging conversation. If anything, my comparison here would be a sort of fireside chat. It really is different when there's no camera on, when it is a little bit more like a podcast format, honestly. That's what it felt like. And yeah, I mean, Trump is very funny. He said a lot of funny things on that, including that my favorite bit of it was when he said that Joe Biden no longer has an IQ, because clearly implicating the fact that the guy has cognitively declined. Anyway, a lot of Trumpisms in this. I think generally a good thing for Trump. He has been a little bit more invisible in the last week in the news cycle, so it's good for him to get back on on everybody's radar. Of course, the coverage of this was far from fair, as you can imagine, and we can get into. There was also to add to this discussion topic before I kick it out to the rest of you, there was a threat from the EU warning Musk in advance, don't you have a conversation with this presidential candidate if there's any information that we deem dangerous or false, then you will be subject potentially to legal penalties. And this comes on the heels of a former high-ranking Twitter official publishing in The Guardian, encouraging the EU to come after Musk legally for allowing free speech on Twitter. So all of that is feeding into they had this attack that attempted to stop this event. Apparently, this conversation between Trump and Musk. You have the EU sending threatening legal letters publicly to Musk, to X, saying, don't have this free-ranging conversation with an American presidential candidate. What do you make of all of this? What do you make of the sort of state of the censorship regime now, the battle between international companies and nation states, right? Because this is, I think there's a level to this that is beyond our normal conversation about sort of censorship in the United States and on the internet. Now we have, an international company that it does uphold free speech, but we have the EU trying to enforce speech mandates, then reaching across the Atlantic and telling, American listeners via this international company, what they can and can't hear, right? So I think there's a lot there. I don't know if any of you caught the space last night. I thought it was good for Donald Trump overall. I thought he was, himself, very funny, very a little bit sort of wide ranging all over the place. He definitely likes to talk, and it was a little bit like two people on a phone, neither of whom really wants to end the conversation and hang up, right? Like there's like a last half hour where they were out of things to say, but neither one of them would actually call it and hang up. But what did you think about the interview itself? What do you think about these legal threats from the EU? And what do you think about the structure of free speech in an environment where we do, fortunately, as we discussed last week, have this one major company that is in favor of free speech, but there's going to be conflicts between US law and EU law on some of this stuff.
So I think there needs to be an understanding among the European Union and its officials that threats can go both ways here. If they even think about censoring or punishing Elon Musk, then we should be thinking about punishing them. I mean, if they want to behave like Venezuela or Iran or other countries that ban social media platforms and try and censor American speech, meddle in American elections, they can be sanctioned. And they can be banned from traveling to the United States and banned from having any dealings with the United States financial system. There should be a general confidence in our system of free speech and a willingness to be a little bit imperial about it in terms of how we, especially when it comes to other countries telling us what we can say. No. Mr. Breton, the French commissioner of the EU, there should be I'll give him one break in the sense that Trump should call him up and tell him, you better never do that again, or there will be real problems for you personally, because it just should be a zero, maybe after this, it should be zero tolerance. The Europeans need to understand that. With that said, I think Trump did well. It was fine. And, it was just enjoyable and relaxed. I don't know. I enjoyed listening to it. I don't know what the Europeans were so afraid of.
This also happened. Go ahead, Ben.
I was just going to say briefly, contrast Will's posture with the posture of not just the Biden-Harris administration, but all of Congress. I mean, it was pretty much, yes, you had some congressmen taking to X or other platforms to basically tell the Europeans, go pound sand. But this is an American platform that protects and fosters Americans' speech. And it's hosting a discussion which is on expressly political matters, the core protected speech in our First Amendment jurisprudence and our tradition. And the administration is totally silent about this attack on X, and Congress isn't threatening any penalties to the EU associated with the threats, with their election interference. And this is to say nothing, by the way, of the alleged DDoS attack, and who knows what the origin of that attack or attacks were on X last night. But the fact that an American company is totally undefended by this regime speaks volumes about the fact that they hold the very same views as the EU. They're just not necessarily as overt about them. And also, last point I'll make on this, and then I'll kick it over to Amber, and then I might have some thoughts after about the substance of the conversation and the media's response to it. But how about the fact that basically the origins of this kind of backdoor attempt to censor American platforms via foreign regimes? Well, if you look at what Mike Benz has written and said about this, there's domestic origins to this. So there's a boomerang. There's an attempt to use any and every lever, including foreign regimes, to backdoor censor Americans in ways that our authorities can't do. It's a chilling way that we're going to see the censorship regime operate during this cycle. And it's something I wrote months back for a Tom Klingenstein site, listing the various ways that the regime will operate this time that will differ from how it operated in 2020.
We also just had this incident involving X, where a nonprofit that has major corporations sign on to it basically lists these minimum standards that platforms or accounts have to abide by in order for them to be deemed fit for advertisement. And these corporations agree to these terms by becoming a member of this organization. And so, I mean, it's basically just another version of Media Matters, where if you do something that these few individuals object to, then you will no longer have the ability to be monetized through paid advertisements from corporations. And Elon Musk responded to this group whose name I can't recall at the moment, by threatening legal action. And they were so scared of the idea of being tied up in court and having to spend all of this money on legal fees that they immediately backed down and decided to suspend their operation to take monetization away from X accounts. And I think it's worth repeating that we have one mainstream platform that is not totally captured by left-wing influence, and it still takes the threat of spending millions of dollars against a quasi-censorship regime, although it's a non-government nonprofit, in order for us to continue to have that. And if Elon Musk at any point decides that the juice isn't worth the squeeze, or that it's not worth the amount of money that he's spending, or the backlash that he's getting, then it would be gone in an instant.
Yeah, just to add a little more beef to that, this is one area in which Musk's lawfare combined with congressional oversight actually did achieve a meaningful result to protect speech. So it was this sub-entity, it's called the GARM, Global Alliance for Responsible Media, which sits under the World Federation of Advertisers, which basically control, I think I've seen the numbers, 90% of total ad spend online, major ad agencies. And basically the idea was, let's have collusion between those who control the ad spending on which basically the media, both traditional media and then social media, exists. And let's, under the guise of brand safety, try and censor conservative and otherwise dissenting voices. And the House Weaponization Committee, certainly the Judiciary Committee, looked into this as a collusive act in restraint of trade. Musk went after them legally, and voila, almost immediately after Musk went after them, GARM disbanded. So a massive win for free speech, but they're trying to use all sorts of different tactics and entities to nuke platforms and then voices on those platforms that our ruling regime doesn't like, all because they're afraid of dissenting ideas, because those dissenting ideas could put them out of business.
And we're going to go right back to you, Ben, for your intro on immigration and how quickly immigration applications are now going through this administration compared to the previous one.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I'm working on a piece as we speak for Real Clear Investigations, which will probably be out maybe by the time this podcast is out, on non-citizen registration and voting in elections and the battles that are going on at the federal and state levels over this issue. And then hours before submitting my final draft of this piece, New York Times printed something adjacent, but I think very interesting and telling, where essentially they touted great replacement theory, although they didn't put it in those terms. And of course, great replacement theory being the notion that our ruling elites are importing immigrants and seeking to basically grant them full rights, including rights to vote, to cancel out the votes of Americans and ultimately change the political and other character of the country. And of course, Democrats say this is a racist far-right conspiracy theory with a nexus to domestic terrorism. In fact, not just Democrats, but our national security apparatus says this in its own terrorism advisory bulletins. And of course, as we've long known, you've had Democrats explicitly coming out and supporting this sort of policy. And now the Times has written, and one question we could grapple with is, why are they writing about this now and sort of gleefully writing about it and cleansing this information? But they have a piece out basically showing that the only area in which the Biden administration is actually working economically and efficiently when it comes to the immigration system is not in terms of deporting people, is not in terms of forcing people to go to court and have their hearings and do so in a timely fashion, but it's actually in naturalizing non-citizens. So remarkably, it appears that under the Biden administration's time in office, the Times reports there have been 3.3 million immigrants who have become citizens. The Times tells us that the cohorts, the populations here, overwhelmingly, historically, have voted Democrat after being naturalized and voting. The time it takes to process naturalization applications has plummeted to 4.9 months at this point for the Biden administration versus 11.5 months, so almost a year, going back to fiscal year 2021. And the administration has done all sorts of things to fast track this naturalization. Remarkably, there's a quote, which is sort of the punchline in this piece, from someone who works in an immigration data analytics company. Quote, "The surge in naturalization efficiency isn't just about clearing backlogs, it's potentially reshaping the electorate merely months before a pivotal election." And the person who said this was Xiao Wang, chief executive of Boundless. He goes on to say, "Every citizenship application could be a vote that decides Senate seats or even the presidency." And with a wink and a nod, the Times also reports, "It's unclear how many of the new voters live in battleground states, but a number of the states where Kamala Harris or Donald Trump must win have large and growing numbers of voting age naturalized citizens, including Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, and Pennsylvania. In Savannah, Georgia, people from 19 countries streamed into a federal courthouse recently to take the oath of allegiance." So, on the one hand, we can talk about naturalization generally, what naturalization rates should look like, what the standards should be, et cetera. When can we deem the current immigrant population sufficiently assimilated? And we can talk about the economic and other issues to dictate what immigration numbers should look like and who we should be naturalizing. But to me, the big takeaway here is the cynical nature of our media regime. And obviously, we're seeing this writ large with the Kamala Harris protective bubble that exists right now. But they say, again, great replacement theory. It's a crazy conspiracy theory of the far right with a nexus to domestic terror. And then in the same breath, they're now telling you that they are engaging in fast tracking naturalization to fast track massive populations of new voters that disproportionately vote Democrat and can swing races, including in 2024. So it's a remarkable admission from the New York Times, in my view. And I'm curious what you guys all think the implications or ramifications of it are.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Ben. This is one of those obvious instances where whether something is right-wing disinformation, conspiracy theory, or whether noticing the exact same phenomenon is worthy of, a spread in the New York Times is completely normal political information that's part of the election discussion depends solely on whose byline and who's running it, right? In the same way that the Time expose after the 2020 election that basically went through piece by piece what ordinary people would call rigging an election, called it fortifying an election, and that was not misinformation, while people saying some of the exact same things were being banned in a coordinated way off of every single platform, right, for spreading lies and disinformation. So another one of those hilarious but not so funny in actual consequence, disjointed way of talking about this, where depending on who's saying it and who's noticing it, it's either crazy conspiratorial misinformation or undeniably true, a part of our politics, completely normal discussion. The second thing that I want to note is the fact that this kind of humming, you get the sense in this entire piece that bureaucracy is just humming along, making new citizens at a remarkable and efficient clip. And that is the reality on so many of these issues, right? That we have this fourth branch of government that has very strong political views of its own. And when the tasks placed in front of it by the ostensibly elected leadership, which is even more ostensibly in the Biden-Harris administration than in previous administrations, but even in previous administrations, right? When they have somebody, the bureaucracy has somebody they agree with in the Oval Office, everything gets done in a timely manner. It's efficient. It hums through, right? Regulations come out at a timely clip. In this case, right, actually processing people's applications for citizenship is happening quickly and efficiently. And then when you have somebody like Donald Trump in the bureaucracy, they haven't. I remember, because I was in, DC at the time, like many of you, they had open conferences on how to stall, how to use their jobs to thwart Donald Trump's policies. This was said openly. You didn't need to look at a Project Veritas video on it. This was being said openly. and covered as sort of a way to join the resistance, use your federal job to join the resistance to thwart the policies of the elected president. And here we see, again, just the undercurrent of this entire report is the bureaucracy is happy with this policy. They want to naturalize as many citizens as possible before the election. They hope that will help Democrats. And therefore, it is happening quickly and efficiently. Whereas when Donald Trump tries to get something, or somebody similar that has views that the bureaucracy generally doesn't agree with, tries to get something through, there's horrific leaking. There is a just straight up inability to do the job, hidden in 50,000 layers of bureaucracy. You can't fire these people, most of them, under current civil service protections, right? And you have this essentially this fifth column within the executive branch that doesn't allow one side of the political spectrum to implement and use the power of the executive the way that Democrats are able to use it.
It's quite rich, by the way, that when we're talking about this in the context of illegal immigration, that the Biden-Harris administration would have you believe that the answer to the border crisis is just to put more Border Patrol agents at the southern border, when we know in reality what that means is just to process people more quickly, to release them into the interior of the country. It doesn't mean any meaningful border security. It doesn't mean that these agents are going to stop people with the intent of going through an expedited removal or even putting them through the process for a deportation. It means giving them an alternative to detention, signing them up for the CBP-1 app, and then putting them inside the country. It was the precise reason why no one who understands how the border actually works took the so-called bipartisan border bill seriously and viewed it for what it was, which was a scam on the American people and really political malfeasance. And now Kamala Harris, fast forward, now that she's the nominee, is trying to, again, use that bill as proof that she is somehow going to be tough on the border when she had 3.5 years to do it and failed to do it. And her administration has all the executive power necessary to do it, but is going to argue against the guy who literally launched his campaign in 2015 as being one of the strictest presidential candidates on immigration, as proof that she's going to be better on the issue than him. It's why when we saw a couple of polls come out this past week that suggested that she was within striking distance of Trump on the issue of who voters trust more to handle immigration, it seems to me that those polls can probably be pretty much outright rejected.
Yeah, I mean, it's the classic Michael Anton celebration parallax, right? Like all of a sudden, something you couldn't talk about that was false and scurrilous if you said it, if you were just, if you were upset about it, if you were happy about it, it's obviously happening and a great thing. That's not happening and it's good that it is, for example. So that's what they're doing with this immigration policy. Obviously, they're just trying to win elections with it. And it's, it's really bad for the country. It makes immigration itself at heart like a vehicle for power and like jockeying for power between the two major factions in our country. It's, I think, probably one of the reasons that our politics is so absolutely polarized. So it's obnoxious that the administration's doing this, and hopefully we elect Trump.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and take the moderator's prerogative and switch to my topic, which is Kamala Harris just shamelessly cribbing one of Trump's most popular policy proposals during this campaign. She, of course, has yet to release an official platform at all, which some Democratic strategists that I've talked to on TV about this have insisted is because they're just waiting for the Democratic convention and she'll take whatever platform the platform committee comes up with then, which makes zero sense, because else why would you ever have a primary if all of your candidates are just going to adopt whatever the official policy platform of the political party is? But nonetheless, she is supposed to be releasing it this week. And one thing she has announced is that she supports getting rid of taxes on tips that are earned by service workers, which is something that Donald Trump introduced months ago, way back in June, and is quite ironic considering the Biden administration has been pretty instrumental in making it more difficult for service workers to avoid getting taxed on their tips. They have empowered the IRS through both the American Rescue Plan and the Inflation Reduction Act to crack down on employees trying to get around getting taxed on tips, whether it's via cash or through digital transfer on platforms like Venmo, Zella, and PayPal, and has created this program where employers opt in to make sure that their employees are reporting all of their tips. She also gave the tie-breaking vote on the Inflation Reduction Act that empowered the IRS with $80 million additional dollars and $80 billion in additional funding, which gave the IRS an additional 80,000 plus employees so that they can make sure that only the rich certainly will no longer be able to dodge their taxes. Of course, in practice, we know that's not how it works. So it's just the latest example of the shameless political maneuvering of Kamala Harris. I don't think there's an authentic bone in her body. I guess the question I would throw to the group is, do you think this is going to work? Could she legitimately just repeat the most popular policy proposals that Trump throws out and effectively nullify those as being a comparative advantage for him in the election? And will voters believe that she's actually going to do any of those things?
Yeah. So I wanted to talk about this one because I think it's fascinating, since I was on a political campaign with DeSantis, and I have some insight into like what it's actually like to be working on it and what putting together a policy platform entails. And it's actually a lot of work, because you got to have people brainstorm it out, figure out what should be in it. You got to talk to stakeholders and make sure they're okay with it. You got to revise it. You got to get it. Finally, you need approval from the candidate. That takes time. Like even during the DeSantis campaign, that was only happening for, that was a lot of what the work was, what work we were doing that early on was doing policy platforms on specific individual issues. And, we had theoretically like a full year to do that. Kamala has what, a month, 6 weeks. So her campaign team is in this bizarre position where they can't do like the normal situation where they have a policy platform rolled out. They have to come up with one, because they don't want to just run on what Joe did. The whole point is to separate from the unpopularity of Joe. And so you've got this bizarre circumstance where I think part of the reason she's not doing any interviews or anything else is that she is part of the reason that she's not doing any interviews or anything else is that she is in the position where she just can't, because her policy platform isn't ready. So that's what is going wrong with her.
I also think that on the point you made about how she's trying to separate herself from Joe Biden's platform and what the administration has been doing the past 3.5 years, she's going to have an incredibly difficult time explaining how she was the number 2 in this administration, yet they seemingly accomplished none of the things that she now says she's going to do in her next 4 years. It's like you have to throw somebody under the bus, whether it's Joe Biden himself, or if you claim that it was because you had a divided Congress during some of that. Once you sit down for an interview and have to explain why your second term is going to be any different than what was effectively your first term, I just don't see how that goes over very well. And she's not an effective enough communicator to thread that needle.
Yeah, I mean, in answer to your question, Amber, is it going to work? It depends on the Trump-Vance campaign, I think, because that's the only wild card in all of this situation. Obviously, the media is going to try to drag her through these 100 days that were down to 90 or 87 days or something like that, right? Without any actual interaction with this normal scrutiny, even of a favorable press, right? What Will and Amber just pointed to about creating a policy platform, being asked questions about her VP pick, being asked questions about her former statements about fracking, about the border, about all of those things. Even if you have a favorable press environment, which Democrats always do, you still have to answer those questions. And really what we're seeing in the dynamics of this race is she got to skip all of the primary vetting, right? Where other Democrats would force her to answer those questions. And now she's getting to skip the entire vetting of the press, or even, even friendly press asking her about any of these questions. And that really leaves it up to Trump and Vance, right? It leaves it up to these two guys who are going to be covered by the press because they can't avoid covering the presidential and vice presidential candidate on the other side. They're going to be covered in a hostile way. But it's up to them to continually shame the press and remind the American people that they're not getting answers to any of these questions, right? So yeah, I really think the answer to your question, Amber, is it depends on the campaign itself, right?
Yeah, and let me just say, I think this was, even though it might have been unintentional, and we'll see who writes the history and when it's written, but part of the genius of swapping her in at the exact time that they did is that it prevented her from having to go through a grueling primary where she would have been exposed, just like she was back in 2020, just among Democrats, let alone when she's trying to actually win not just that half of the country, or at least some percentage of non-leftists. But she's insulated now, where it running out the clock and playing prevent defense essentially is a strategy that makes sense when you have a candidate that is, from my vantage point, wholly inauthentic, radically left wing, and maybe the Walz pick was to actually make her look less left wing on a relative basis, quite frankly. But the strategy makes total sense of basement campaign 2.0 to the extent you can have it, minimum amount of debates possible. And debates, I think, really are of outsized importance and crucial here, because it's one of the only times where, yes, she's going to have obviously the media cheerleading for her and protecting her, but Trump is going to be able to take her on head on and throw curveballs at her and punches at her that she has not had to face at all. We'll see how disciplined and prepared she is for that. I would make one observation, and one to me, like the strategy for going at her in this, because I agree to Inez, it's going to be totally on essentially Trump Vance to do all the work the media won't do. One thing is, it's hilarious to me that her website is basically donate to me to find out what the platform is going to be, because there is no platform on the website, but you do have the campaign contribution solicitation. So you have to fund the candidate to find out what the candidate's all about, to sort of play on Nancy Pelosi's pass the bill to find out what's in it. And that perfectly sums up, I think, Kamala Harris. And related to that, and Trump has already put this out, and I guess maybe his first tweet back on Twitter yesterday, where he said, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? That's one question. And a related question is, Kamala Harris, you're responsible for the Biden-Harris agenda. That really is what forced Joe Biden off the ticket because of its unpopularity and the disasters in its wake. So do you dismiss and basically reject the entire agenda that you represented? But to me, the third question, and this is the pivotal one, because of Kamala's flip-flopping on the issues where she has actually staked out a position, and it's pretty much always been through spokespeople, it's not actually her, but take them at face value as representing, or more than face value as representing the candidate. The question for her is going to be on fracking, on crime, on immigration, etc. Are you lying now, or were you lying then about what your positions are? Either of the answers that she can have on the merits are bad answers. One would be she is the radical leftist that she was back in 2020, and I think would be consistent with her record. The other is she is non-ideological, holds no positions whatsoever, and she's willing to take any position she needs to seize power. So she's ruthlessly ambitious and will do anything to take and grow her power. She has to be pressed on that question, I think. Are you lying now, or were you lying then? To me, that's a pivotal question that could be a real differentiator, to the extent that the merits at all matter and Americans in decisive numbers in swing states can be moved. And I am, very black-pilled and dubious about, how much can you move people, because I think people are largely decided. And so there's a question of, how do you hit the people that you think you need to hit, to the extent there's a big enough population that can actually be moved? Again, discounting for the massive propaganda information operation that regime media is implementing right now.
And as a helpful transition to our final topic with Will, I thought JD Vance did a nice job on CNN this weekend, connecting Tim Walz's lies about his service record to Kamala being a generally dishonest candidate, and how choosing him as her vice presidential running mate shows a serious lapse in judgment. And luckily, Will is going to take us through all of the controversies surrounding Tim Walz's service record and what has been said about it by him, his friends, and the media over the past couple of decades.
Yeah. So the big story of later last week was the revelations about Tim Walz and his really terrible behavior as a National Guardsman and afterwards. using false, basically making false statements about his record and engaging in stolen valor. So I think there are two big categories of issues. The first is deployment dodging. Walz was about to be what's called he was frocked a command sergeant major, which is the highest ranking non-commissioned officer in the Army, is my understanding. I'm not an expert in this, but I'm trying to, relay it as best I can. So a command sergeant major is a very, very important role. You oversee something like 500 people in a battalion. And you're a key person there. You can't just easily and simply be replaced. And so Walz had been in the National Guard for 24 years. The National Guard got notification that their unit would be deploying to Iraq. And Walz at first told some of his colleagues, other command sergeant majors, other people in his chain of command, that he would be deploying with the unit. And then he was running for Congress. He changed his mind, put in his retirement papers, and managed to get a retirement. Didn't even talk to his direct superior, actually went 3 or 4 levels above him to talk to somebody at the Minnesota National Guard headquarters. And that's the first thing. A lot of people are very upset about that, because while technically he had the right to retire because of his years, most of the time he wouldn't have been allowed to do so if he talked to his direct superior. And it's just particularly obnoxious because everybody I've talked to in the military or with military experience says it's just unheard of for a senior NCO like that to just up and quit on a deployment. And Walz this would have been the first time that Walz actually served in a combat zone. He'd never done that before. And the moment he would have seen combat, he quit, which connects to the second thing, which is that Walz made a habit of essentially, he at times has straight up engaged in stolen valor. He once said that he carried weapons of war in a war. He never was in a combat zone. He also has the habit of not correcting other people when they suggest he's an Afghanistan war veteran. There's been plenty of C-SPAN clips and other clips of him speaking where somebody introduces him as a combat veteran or a veteran of Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan, and he nods along but doesn't correct them. So this is a guy who's pretty often routinely engaged in stolen valor. And, stolen valor might not seem like a big deal to those of us who are outside the military. It's like, okay, well, this is just another politician lie. To veterans, it's a really big deal. And it's a massive own goal because, veterans have families and friends. They've lost lives. They really do not appreciate it when people lie about their service record for political gain. And given how close this election is likely to be, I think it's going to be a big deal. I think, the way the Democrats have tried to spin this off, they say, well, he served for so long. I mean, that clearly should be applauded. But J.D. Vance was on point on this, saying that, yes, we should acknowledge his service, but we can criticize the way he quit and we can criticize him for lying about it. So I think this is actually going to be a big deal. I don't think this is going away. They're trying to say it's like swift voting, but in reality, here's the really funny thing about swift voting that I'm actually looking into. That was a pejorative created by the left to deal with the fact that there were people making legit and truthful criticisms of John Kerry's military record himself. And they're like, they didn't actually answer those criticisms. They just came up with a pejorative, swift voting, to try and discredit the whole thing. So, there isn't a President John Kerry, so maybe this stuff actually does work.
I think this brings to the fore a broader question about why is Walz on the ticket? What is the point? And maybe the simplistic answer is that Democrats have such contempt for the voters and they think Americans are so ignorant that they thought they could just put up this guy who gives the appearance aesthetically of being just a moderate Midwestern, humble governor, all-American from Nebraska, which cloaks the fact that he's actually engaging in the stolen valor, which is despicable. And I think to Will's point, definitely is going to have negative impacts for Democrats among the very voters in theory they'd want to win in the Rust Belt and beyond. The China ties, which I think are, you could argue not necessarily on par with the Bidens because his family didn't take in millions of dollars associated with communist China. But the guy has gone there over 30 times, I think spent a year there, has lauded the regime. His wedding day, I think, is the same day as Tiananmen. Just absurd China love from him and basically shilling for the Chinese Communist Party with the propaganda he's put out on behalf of the party. A very bizarre relationship, disturbing relationship there. And then again, the positions on immigration, obviously, with respect to crime, Do you want to make America Minneapolis or the Twin Cities after what we've seen transpire there with him at the helm as governor? You put all of this together, and the question is, again, is it about contempt for the American people, thinking that you can put them up on the ticket and it's going to create the appearance of somehow trying to attack to the middle? Or conversely, is the campaign strategy actually to try and juice the progressive vote to the maximum extent and damn basically the rest of the electorate? If that's the case, on paper, that would look like an incredibly risky strategy. But on the other hand, if they are actually confident that that's a winning strategy, I think that would be a disturbing conclusion for us also. So, I do think this points to broader questions about Walz, but in the very narrow sense and important sense, the stolen Valor issue, perfect illustration of the inauthenticity and disingenuousness of the ticket, and it's appalling on the merits.
Yeah, I'll throw in the other sort of low stakes or lower stakes issue that he's been accused of sort of embellishing, which is his record as a high school football coach, which sounds kind of silly, but I think it represents a pattern in that he has been described as having, come in and led this team to states after consecutive losing seasons and being the guy who turned the team around, and he's described it that way himself. And you look into it and it's like, oh, he was the defensive coordinator, which it's not yes, you were still part of the team, but I think coming from a town with a very good high school football team, nobody would realistically credit the defensive coordinator with being the one to take the team to states. And it's just, again, part of this larger pattern of dishonesty with this guy who doesn't seem to have the ability to be fully honest and transparent about just about anything. I mean, in fact, the most honest he's been, I think, in his political career was when he admitted that his response during the 2020 riots was an abject failure.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're really separating some of these claims into two buckets. So the first one is the complicated story about how and the circumstances under which he retired and did not deploy with his unit. I agree with Will that I think that probably matters a lot to veterans. I think for the average person, that's probably a combination of too complicated and also just, I think a legitimate position, which I sort of share myself, which is, if you haven't been in the military, who are we to criticize the circumstances under which he took his legal retirement, right? So I think that side of things is probably less, is less resonant with the average voter. The thing that's really clear is the part that JD Vance has been hitting, which is the guy has clearly, repeatedly gone right up to the edge and sometimes over it in terms of implying that he was in war. And I think the lying aspect of it is something that everybody understands and everybody cares about, right? Not just people in and around the community of veterans in the United States, but I think every voter understands that's really a quite despicable thing to do, to imply and to allow. And it's not something that happened once, right? Where you could kind of use these weasel words and say, he just didn't correct someone in time, or it was misunderstood. His words were misunderstood. It's happening again and again. And it seems like every other day there's another instance of it that comes out. So it seems like it was consistently part of how he's been presenting himself to the American people, to voters, since he's been running for political office. So, I think that makes it very fair game. The other thing is it goes to what both Amber and Ben have said, right? It goes to the credibility of why Walz is on the campaign to begin with, right? The argument for Walz was basically, oh, this guy is normie Midwest dad. He's got a connection to the football coach connection. He's got, this demeanor. I think it was funny watching all of the news media, and I think David Herciani pointed this out, and I might have said this last week, but every single mainstream news outlet using the phrase exactly, folksy demeanor, right? Repeating those two words over and over and over again. And I think it goes to show that quote folksy demeanor is inaccurate with regard to some of his incredibly extreme policies that we've talked about here, and I'm sure we'll continue to talk about his actions as governor during the riots of 2020. his cultural policies around transition of minors, right, and parental custody, just generally the actions that he's taken and the way he's governed as a far leftist. All of those things are sort of policy ways in which he is not your average American normie. But these kinds of stories, the way he's implied that he has served in a war zone repeatedly over and over again in a way that he just simply did not, I think goes to a quite potent attack that the Trump Vance campaign should make use of, which is, this guy and his principal, right, Kamala Harris, they're all over the place. They're chameleons. They're lying to you. They were either lying then or they're lying now. They're misrepresenting themselves. They're misrepresenting their positions, right? And I think that is probably a really good line of attack for the Trump Vance campaign, to be honest, because there's so much there. But it's going to be something they're going to have to try to force through a media that is going to be absolutely hostile to covering any piece of this.
Yeah, the folksy thing really gets me. There was an article last week in Politico from the ubiquitous menswear guy on Twitter who just criticizes right-wing people.
That guy's such a fraud.
I know. He's like, oh, you're right-wing, your clothes suck. You're left-wing, you look great, wonderful. But he wrote an entire article about Tim Walz's how he is an expert in casual wear. And he went through talking about how he was wearing a classic hunter's jacket that every Midwest hunter wears when they go out in the field. And it was like a $500 jacket or shirt or something from Filson. And I just started cracking up when I clicked the link to follow what this jacket was. And also all the LL Bean, when I was growing up, LL Bean was considered so bougie, nobody actually wore LL Bean. We just looked at the catalogs and wished we could buy it. So that was a good, fun example of the media's just absolute slobbery over this ticket. I will go ahead and take the prerogative again on final thoughts and just mention that Trump is suing the DOJ for $100 million in damages over their raid of Mar-a-Lago in the classified documents case, which has since been dismissed because of the allegedly illegal appointment of Special Prosecutor Jack Smith. So I think it's great that he's fighting back and that he still has the money and the gumption to do so after really all of the lawfare that he's been through. And we'll, of course, follow that lawsuit and see if he can, at least in this one instance, hold the deep state accountable for what they've done in terms of political prosecution and weaponization of their power.
So I've got
my final thought will be, sorry, I don't know if you can hear my cat, but is actually to give some credit where credit is due to JD Vance. The reason that there's any mainstream coverage of a lot of the stuff we just discussed is because JD Vance did a blitz on the Sunday talk shows. He was sharp. He was aggressive. In many cases, he ran circles around his interlocutors, who were extremely hostile to him, as you would imagine. I just think there's been this weird drumbeat, even among the sort of mainstream right, because probably they don't like some of JD Vance's more populist positions or whatever it is. But just be honest and write that you don't like his position on trade or whatever it is, that there's this weird drumbeat about, oh, he's been a disaster of a VP pick. I mean, as far as I can tell, since he's been chosen, yes, he's been under fire for comments that he made 3 or 5 years ago, and we talked about that last time. But since he's been picked as VP, he's delivered a great speech at the convention. He's done a bunch of press Q&As where he's done really well. He's been good at rallies. He just did a huge blitz on hostile media where he came out on top nearly in every exchange, as far as I can tell. This guy is killing it, and he's really focused on 2 major points, which it's good to have sometimes. As much as I really enjoy the meandering Trump Musk podcast format, with the very Trumpist sort of comments that often, wander off the messaging path of the campaign. It's good to have a counterpoint in Vance where in every single interview, he's hitting two things. One is the Waltz service record and the dishonesty there that we just discussed in the last segment. And the second thing is that Kamala isn't answering questions. I don't know what this is, day 24 since she's been, I don't even want to say formally, informally, the top of the ticket, the Democratic candidate for president, and she still hasn't actually sat down even with the most glowingly friendly press to give an interview. And the only reason either one of those things is breaking through at all to the mainstream sort of discourse in America is because JD Vance has been saying it in every single interview. The reason that we're talking about the Waltz service record is because JD Vance has not let the mainstream media forget it in any single interview. So I think he deserves credit where credit is due. He's been really focused, really on message, and he's been doing a great job.
Yeah, I mean, kind of following along that, I think JD Vance has done a great job. I also think the Trump campaign's doing a pretty good job. I think there's one of the things I saw from a lot of people is this sort of weird discontent with the Trump campaign in the aftermath of Kamala coming to the fore. And I mean, people need to realize it's like, obviously the Democrats are just straight up relieved that they're not stuck with Joe Biden anymore. And so that's something that the campaign has no control over. They're just, that's events overtaking things in the short term. And I think that, political campaigns are not, all powerful, omnipotent features. They're just like surfers surfing the wave and trying to do it well. So, in terms of the things that I see that matter, they did a really good job keeping Trump quiet when the Dems were in disarray. That was a smart decision, and they were effective at doing that. They've gotten JD Vance out there. They've realized he's maybe the most effective surrogate Trump has. They're on top of this stolen valor stuff. Like there's no obvious communication strategy that they're not taking. I think, you could criticize maybe them being a little over aggressive and shutting down Project 2025 and trying to distance themselves from that. But in the grand scheme of things, I don't look at this campaign and think, oh my gosh, what are they doing? It's terrible. It looks like they've actually got some competent people in charge and are doing pretty well.
Yeah, to me, I think the challenge to the campaign is going to be how do you expose Kamala Harris? What venues do you have to go to? How do you calibrate your message? And can you stay on message and keep it to a simple 3 points about immigration, inflation, economy broadly, maybe national security as well to some extent? How do you break through the world's largest censorship regime of all time, which is operating even when we're not clear on how it's operating, plus a media that, on the other hand, while dissenting views are suppressed and derogatory views are suppressed, on the other hand, the propaganda is at a volume we've never seen. And the media, I mean, for me at least, I don't know that I've ever seen the media so overt in the sheer level of propaganda, celebrating it, brazen in it right now, is a remarkable thing to witness. To tangential points, during the Trump-Musk conversation, there was one exchange about Ukraine and Putin where, and to quote Trump here, basically Trump laid out, he says to Vladimir Putin, here are all the things that will happen if you effectively cross a red line. And he says, Putin said, no way. And Trump's response was way. And so it was a hilarious exchange, the way that Trump described it, very on brand. But also something that there's a serious point to this, which is what he said there is consistent with what Trump told me when I had the chance to interview him at Trump Tower back in 2021 about national security and foreign policy. And he said these things publicly before as well about essentially all of the malign forces in the world. When he talked to principals, leaders of adversarial countries, he basically said, if you do X, we will respond with Y. Overwhelming force of a kind that no leader publicly threatens in the modern era here in America. And the thing that struck me was that the proof was in the pudding of how safe America was and how our armed forces were not under siege worldwide under Donald Trump. It struck me that, and this is kind of terrifying on one level, but at the same time, comforting that it can work this way. a single man can be a deterrent, can serve as a deterrent to all the malign forces in the world, and can also check or counterbalance the rot beneath that single man and the corruption of that we talk about almost weekly in terms of national security, foreign policy, and defense. So to me, one of the questions on the ballot this year, and I don't know if Americans will see it this way, but do you want a person who can stand against all of these adversarial forces and actually stare them down, where they're not sure if he's serious or not about what he's threatening, but in their own minds, they know that there's a percentage chance that he would unleash hell on them. And that maintained peace before. Do Americans want that again? There's absolutely no way that a Harris-Walz ticket could stand up to a Trump-Vance ticket in the way of staring down our adversaries and keeping the country safe and secure in an increasingly dangerous and volatile world. So that's just one thing that struck me in terms of the Trump-Musk conversation. It's consistent with the interview that I had with him several years back, and I hope it's an issue that the American people consider when they go to the polls or send in their ballots, I guess, starting as soon as September.
Well, thank you for closing us out, Ben. That's going to do it for us this week. On behalf of Inez, Ben, and Will, I'm Amber Duke, and we will see you at the next NatCon Squad.